You start a Mishnah saying what's an Asherah. You just had a whole Mishnah and Gemara discussing the types of Asherah. What do you mean it's Asherah? We already had that we had 3 different types of Asherah and so on and so forth. So says the Gemara, no, Haki Kamar. This is Shtayim L'divrei Hakol. We have 2 different types of Asherah that everybody agrees that is Asur. Out of the 3 that the Mishnah mentioned above, 2 of them is the Kula Alma. 2 of them everybody agrees that are Asur. 1 of them is Machloket Rabbi Shimon and Chachamim. And that's the last one. So in other words, when the Mishnah says, Shalosh Asherot hen, Ilan sheneta'o mitechila, if you planted the tree for Avodah Zarah, if you turned it into an Avodah Zarah after plantation, and then the third one, that's those 2 everyone agrees. The third one, of He'emid Tachteha Avodat Kochavim, is Machloket. So says the Gemara, Kol sheyesh Tachteha Avodat Kochavim, that becomes Machloket. The Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan, what is the case of Avodah Zarah v'Asherah that is Machloket Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon? Kol sheyesh tachteha Avodat Kochavim. The tree that underneath it there is Avodat Kochavim. Rabbi Shimon omer kol she'ovdim ota. Rabbi Shimon says is not every tree that you have beneath it Avodat Kochavim, but it has to be ovdim ota. Even if you have an Avodah Zarah beneath it, still it will be mutar until they actually serve it itself. So Ezu Ashura, Stam. Like Gemara says, wait a second, that's great. If we know that this tree is being served, it's a place of Avodat Kochavim, great. So then you have to deal with it as you have to deal with it. But how do you know if a tree is Avodah Zarah altogether? If you go into a new place, you don't know, you don't have on your vase where the Avodah Zarah trees are. So how do you know to be careful from a tree of Avodah Zarah? Because as we will see in the next Mishnah, there are halachot regarding even benefiting basic benefits. You know, you're walking back in the day, and you have cars and so on. You want to, take off a little bit and have a little rest stop somewhere and sit under the shade of a tree. You can't do that if it's an Avodah Zarah tree. Even though that you're not doing it, just sitting under the shade is a problem. So therefore, how do you know which tree is going to be Avodah Zarah? So says the Gemara, it's simple. Amar Rav, kol shekumarim yoshvin tachteha. Any tree that you find that the priests of Avodah Zarah are sitting beneath it and they don't use any of the fruits. Ve'en to'amin miperoteha. And they don't use the fruits of this tree. The Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says no. Afiru, even if you could have a case that they actually do consume the fruits, and still is a sign of Avodat Kochavim. Hani Tamri, if you hear that the Kumarim underneath the tree are sitting and say, Hani Tamri Reben Nitzrafi. And they say, well, we're going to use this tamarim, these dates, for the Avodah Zarah. So they are going to eat the fruits of the tree, and that yet still could be used in a way that's not considered disrespectful for the Avodah Zarah, because the Rami Beshichra Veshati Leh B'Yom Edam. The way they would do it is they would make shchar tamarim, they would make alcoholic beverages from it, and they will use it on their Chag, under Yom Tov. So this way, says Shmuel, it's not considered disrespect, because why is it that they wouldn't eat the fruits, use the fruits? Because it's disrespect to the Avodah Zarah. So therefore, says Rav, you find the tree that the Kumarim are sitting beneath it, and they're not using the fruits, Chazaku Baruch, that's going to be in Asherah. Shmuel says no, sometimes you could have them use it even, and it still is Avodah Zarah. How can they use it without being considered disrespect to Avodah Zarah? They would make shchar tamarim and they would use it on the holidays, so to speak, of this Avodah Zarah for itself, for the kavod of Avodah Zarah. So therefore, that would be also, as says the Gemara, Amar Amemar. Amruli Savi de Pumbedita, halacha kishmon. Amemar said, in the name of Savi de Pumbedita, which is again Rav Yehuda is part of Savi de Pumbedita. The halacha is like Shmuel, that you could sometimes find the fruits and products of the tree of Avodah Zarah being used lichvod Avodah Zarah itself, and therefore that would still be asur even though that they're actually using the tree itself. Fine. Next Mishnah says, Lo yeshev behetzilah ve'im yashav tahor. You should not sit under the shade of an Asherah tree, but if you did sit, you are still tahor. Now, what's the question of whether or not you're tahor? Because you remember earlier on, the Lamed Bet, there's a little chazara over here, we learned from a drasha, the Gemara is going to repeat again here, that Avodah Zarah not only is asur b'hana'ah, but it is also metameh kemet. It's a source of tum'ah just like a corpse. So what happens if you go under a ceiling with a corpse? You'll become tameh. So from the drasha we learn that Avodah Zarah is the same way. So even though that you didn't touch it, you'll still become tameh tumat ohel in that way. So says the Mishnah, now again, Lo yeshev betzilah. You should not sit under the shade of a tree of Avodah Zarah. So that we could all relate to. But if you did sit, tahor, you're still tahor. So how does that work exactly? That you're sitting under a tree and you're tahor? How does that work? It should be tameh. And the Mishnah then says, Velo ya'avor tachteha, and don't pass beneath the tree, underneath the branches of the tree, ve'im avar, and if you did, you're tameh. In this case, you'll be tameh, because you passed underneath. And Avodah Zarah, it's tameh kemet, you're tameh. Now we got to come back to this. It's going to be the initial question of the Gemara. Haita gozelet et harabim. How about if the tree is made on the path of people? Somebody goes and plants a tree of Avodah Zarah and develops it mamash in the Reshut Harabim in the middle of a road. So I can't pass through the road because there's an Avodah Zarah. Can it block my way? My way, that was my way for years. It was Derech Rabim. This, for decades and decades, has been the path that people pass through. Now this guy came and put out a tree over there with all kinds of interesting things underneath. So does that make it now asur for everyone? So says the Mishnah, and then you passed underneath it, tahor, you don't become tameh. So you have a case that you literally went under an Avodah Zarah and you don't become tameh. Why? Because it's stealing. It's not allowed to be there. So you have to now explain, what does that mean? That means only b'di'evet avar tachteha, only if you did, or can you l'chatchila say the Shem Yichud go through, because again, this is stealing over here, right? You're not allowed to make it asur for me. Now, there's such a concept, right? There are some poskim that even use this for halachot of tefillah. For instance, Maran writes in Siman Kuf Bet in Orach Chaim that if somebody is standing in tefillah, it's asur to pass in front of them. You cannot pass within 4 amot, 6 feet in front of them. According to the Mekubalim, others, you can't pass in front of them regardless of how far you are. Standing to daven, the whole thing is esh, right? Shekhinah is in front of you, cannot pass in front of them. You're disturbing their kavara. There are many, many reasons for it. So the problem is, many times you want to enter the shul, and someone has come late to the tefillah, and he's standing in the hallway, and it's right in front of the door. So in order to get into the shul, you have to pass in front of him. Now nobody could get into the shul, right? Because you can't pass in front of a mitpalel. So what do? So it's tshuva from Rabbi Sarah Stern in Shuvot B'Selach Chochma, Chelek Vav Siman Lamed and Lamed Aleph, I believe it is. And he writes that no, you could pass in front of them. Why? Because he cannot answer the regular pathway of people. It's a different thing when you have, let's say, a yeshiva, a bet midrash, or a shul, that there are tables set and there's a path that goes in front of the table. That's not derech habim, because that's an official seat in the shul, and that would make the aisle in front of it asur. But the hallway right before the door belongs to people. It's not meyuchat for tefillah. It's not designated for a person to stand and down there. So he's stealing from derech rabim. He cannot do that. Right? That's what Stern Paskins, lahakel, that he could pass in front of it, marsham, whatever, for a different time. But this is the concept that a person can't take a public domain and make it a problem of Avodah Zarah, that now you cannot pass through it. Says the Mishnah, if you pass through it, you don't become tameh. Whether or not you could do that lechatchila or not, something we have to deal with in the Gemara. So says the Gemara. Lo yeshev b'sila. The beginning of the Mishnah is you should not sit in the shade of this tree. So says the Gemara, what do you mean? Lo yeshev b'sila. Pshita. Of course you cannot sit in the shade of the tree. Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo nitzrecha la letzel sila. Of course, the cell itself is pashut because you're directly benefiting from it. But there's a concept of sel sila. What's sel sila? So my understanding is sel sila. Sometimes if the sun is all the way in the east or all the way in the west, not the middle of the day, then the more slanted it is towards the horizon, the longer of a shade you get. So in the beginning of the day or towards the end of the day, you'll have a very long shade of anything. So you could have something that's a tree that's 20 feet long, and the shade, instead of being 20 feet, it will be 60 feet, it will be 50 feet, 40 feet long. Now, the Gemara's understanding is anything past the length of the thing itself is considered a double cell. It's not as strong, that shade, and therefore it will be less of a problem. So betzila, within the first, let's call it 20 feet for our example, if the tree is 20 feet tall, within the first 20 feet is sila. After that, it's a weaker shade. It does not necessarily provide, even scientifically, maybe it's not as cool in the sun, in a hot sun. If you go underneath the tree, which is a wide, nice shade, it's much cooler. The wind is better. If you go on the tippy top of the shade, which is like 60, 100 feet away, you're still in shade, but the degree of heat is pretty much the same thing as outside, or maybe a little bit different. So it's not really benefiting that much. And the chidush is that even in that scenario, that you have tzel sila, that's also asur. Not only tzilah is asur, but even the tzel sila, the extension of the tzel, also would be asur. Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo nitzrecha la letzel sila. It is only to come to add that the extension of the tzel, the shade, also is asur. Michlal lebesel komata im yashav tameh. Gemara asks, says, wait a second, you're suggesting that only in tzel sila you are not tameh if you sat there. But if you sit in the actual shade within the first 20 feet, that would be tameh. And Gemara says, no, that's not what we mean. Lo, da afilu lesel komata nami im yashav tahor. If you sat already anywhere in the shade, you're tahor. What's coming to teach you, the afilu letzel sila lo yeshev. It's coming to teach you the chidush of the first initial line of the Mishnah is that you cannot use any part of the tzel, any part of the shade, even if it's the very end of it, which is not really that beneficial. Still, you're benefiting a little bit from sitting in the shade and not being exposed to direct sun. Still will be asur. So says the Gemara, there are those who learn this on the Seifa of the Mishnah. How so? Ve'im yashav tahor. That the Mishnah says, don't sit under the shade, but if you did sit under the shade, you're tahor, right? And according to this learning, the Gemara asks, Pshita, of course you gotta be tahor. If you sat, you're gonna be Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Lo nitzrecha la letzel komata. It's coming to teach you that not only you're tahor if you sat betel tzila, in the extension of the shade, but you will still be tahor even if you sat in the shade itself, in the actual initial part of the shade, which is gesund, nice and cool, and provides proper shade. So says the Gemara, does that suggest that you could lechatchila even decide to sit in the extension part farther away from the tree? The Gemara says, no, that's not what he means at all. Only the only thing it teaches you is that if you sat under even the actual part of the shade, you still are tahor, you don't become tameh. So hence, what do we have so far? The Mishnah says there are two elements of shade. There's the good part of the shade, and then there's the extension at the very end. Both of them are asur for a person to use. You can't sit under any of them. But if you sat, you're tahor, you don't become tameh. Now you have to go back to our original question. How in the world are you tahor if you sat under a tree? If you go under a tree, you should become tameh immediately. And that's the second part of the Mishnah. Im avar tachteha, if you went beneath it, you become tahor, tameh. So says the Gemara. This that the Mishnah said, that if you passed underneath the tree, you become tameh. My tama, what's the reason for it? Says the Gemara. Because it's impossible that there is no tikrovet avodah zarah there. You have avodah zarah always under a tree of Asherah, right? If the tree is served itself and you have no avodah zarah, no getchka underneath it, you at least have a tikrovet avodah zarah. They bring offerings to the avodah zarah. Always they have something underneath there. And if the tree itself is avodah zarah, it's not avodah zarah, then for sure it's an Asherah because there's an avodah zarah beneath. So however you slice it, there's either an avodah zarah underneath there or a tikrovet avodah zarah. And says the Gemara, Mani, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beterai. This must be Rabbi Yehuda ben Beterai. Now, let's do a quick chazara of what we learned in the Lamed Bet. The Tanya, we learned in the Lamed Bet. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beterai Omer, Minayin letikrovet avodat kochavim shemetama beohel. How do we know that tikrovet avodah zarah is metameh beohel? That if you are under the same ceiling with it, it will become tameh. You will become tameh. Shenemar ve'ismedu lebar peor, by the story of Midian, it says that the Bnei Israel became attached to the Avodah Zarah of Baal Peor, v'yochlu zivchei metim, and they ate zivchei metim. So the pasuk compares the Avodah Zarah with a corpse. Ma met metameh beohel, just like a corpse is metameh beohel, af tikrovet avodat kochavim metameh beohel. The tikrovet Avodah Zarah also, the offerings to Avodah Zarah, also is metameh beohel. So therefore, if you have tikrovet avodah zarah beneath the tree, and you came under the tree, it also makes you asur. So what is it that we said in the shade is mutar? It's of course talking about the shade that's not beneath the tree, right? Shade you could have beneath the tree, and you could have the tree if it's tall. The shade of it could be all the way here too, which there's no branches after this. So if you're going under the shade of the tree, under the branches, then that would make you asur if there's tikrovet avodah zarah beneath it. But if you are off limits of the branches, but you're still in the shade, then that's the first part of the Mishnah, that you don't become tameh. The shade itself is not metameh, because it's not ohel. But nevertheless, you're still benefiting from avodah zarah, therefore it will be asur to do that. So says the Gemara, two dots in the middle of the Amud. They asked them Bet Midrash, Avar or Over, is it only that if you passed underneath it, that the last part of the Mishnah that says Avar Tachtea Tahor, that if the Mishnah, if the Avodah Zarah is stealing the path of Rabim, if you passed underneath it, said the Mishnah, you're not tameh. So the Gemara asks a obvious question: is it only b'di'evet when you passed that you don't become tameh, but you cannot lechatchila decide to pass underneath it? Or maybe even lechatchila you could say, I'm going because you're not allowed to steal my path, so I'm going underneath it and I still don't become tameh. Which one is it? So says the Gemara, it's machloket. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar, Mishmet Chizkiya Amar, over. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, im avar. Rabbi Yochanan says only b'di'evet, and Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar, in the name of Chizkiya, says that you could do even lechatchila. So Chizkiya says it's lechatchila. Rabbi Yochanan says it's b'di'evet. That's what we have so far. V'lo pligi, and the Gemara says it's not a machloket between them. Hadeika darka acharina, hadeleka darka acharina. It depends if you have another path to pass through, right? We spoke about this recently from the Gemara in Baba Batra, Daf Nun Zayin. There the Gemara speaks about if you have a path that involves seeing things that are not fully tzanua, right? Are you allowed to go? Are you not allowed to go? Ikadar kacharina, lekadar kacharina. So Gemara says over here is the same thing. Well, it may be mutar if it's stealing the path of Rabim, but do you have another option? Do you have an alternative path to pass through? So says the Gemara, Amar le Rav Sheshet. So in other words, Rabbi Yochanan, who says it's only b'di'evet, not lechatchila, is talking about the case that you do have another path. And Chizkiya, who says that you could go even lechatchila, is talking about the case that you don't have an alternative path. That's what the Gemara is saying. Now the Gemara asks a question from a story that happened. We had a case with Rav Sheshet that he told his shamash that who is taking him on the path, and they were passing beneath an Avodah Zarah that was planted on a public domain, and Rav Sheshet tells his shamash, says, when we get there, pass me through very quickly. Run. Pass me through like quick. And the Gemara says, wait a second, what's the scenario over here? If you tell me that there's no other way, it's lechatchila, and there is no other way here, so then why do you have to run? Just go like a mensch. If there is another way, what are you doing going past it? It's b'di'evet only mutar. Lechatchila is not mutar. So says the Gemara, ki matid lahatam arhitani, run me, let's go quick. Hechidam, the Gemara says, what's the scenario? If there is no other path, so then says the Gemara, lama le'aritani, why do you have to run? You could pass slowly. It's mutar lechatchila according to everyone. And if there is another alternative path, if you run, it becomes mutar. Who says it becomes mutar? It's asur to go there lechatchila if there is an alternative path. Gemara says no. There's no other. There was the scenario of Rav Sheshet was that there was no alternative path. This was the only path. You will ask, let him just walk slowly. Says the Gemara, that's for me and you. But Adam Chashuv, someone like Rav Sheshet, or the Amoraim, Gedolei Chachamim, for him it's ugly to pass underneath a tree of Avodah Zarah, even though that technically is mutar. So therefore, it's like, it's ma'us, it's disgusting. So he said, run me quickly, that we should be obvious that we are appalled by the reality of this. Adam Chashuv Shani, says the Gemara, the truth is, the case was, there's no other alternative path, and even though that it was mutar, Adam Chashuv, someone important like Rav Sheshet, it will be different, and hence he had the shamash quickly take him, not walking normally. And that concludes our Gemara. Bezrat Hashem, we'll start the next Mishnah in the days to come.